0312 a.m. along Venezuela's northern coast. A command order moves down the chain faster than expected. Radar crews switch modes. Patrol units change routes. What had been a measured response is now wider, louder, harder to reverse. On one screen, multiple contacts overlap. On another, a signal spikes where none existed minutes earlier. Voices tighten. Someone asks whether the Americans have crossed a line, or whether Venezuela just has. Then a radar locks on. No missiles launch, no bombs fall. But in that moment, restraint gives way to reaction. U.S. forces adjust posture. Venezuelan units press forward under expanded authority. Neither side fires first. Yet, within minutes, a single development turns this expanded response into something neither command fully planned for. An escalation begins to take shape. The expanded Venezuelan response does not emerge in a vacuum. It follows months of pressure built from smaller, quieter moves, U.S. surveillance flights that stop just short of sovereign airspace, naval presence that remains technically international, and political signals framed as deterrence rather than threat. Each action is calibrated to avoid escalation. Each one taken alone appears manageable. From Caracas, however, the picture looks different. Venezuelan command planners interpret these moves not as isolated gestures, but as a pattern. In their assessment, the risk is not an imminent strike, but normalization, an environment where U.S. presence becomes routine and uncontested. Allow that to settle and deterrence erodes without a shot ever being fired. The response, therefore, is designed to expand visibility and raise costs without provoking open conflict. This is where strategy begins to narrow. Venezuela's military options are limited by asymmetry. It cannot challenge U.S. air power head-on. It cannot sustain prolonged naval engagement. What it can do is complicate the environment, increase patrol density, activate additional radar nodes, and shorten the decision loop for frontline units. Authority shifts downward. Time for confirmation shrinks. Reaction replaces deliberation. For U.S. planners, the dilemma is equally sharp. Withdrawing signals. Weakness. Advancing risks misinterpretation. The objective is not dominance, but control, maintaining freedom of maneuver while preventing a localized response from turning into a regional crisis. That balance depends on predictability. Expanded response undermines that predictability. As Venezuelan forces widen their defensive posture, the battle space grows more crowded and less stable. More sensors mean more data, but also more false positives. More patrols mean greater coverage, but also more chances for accidental contact. Every added layer increases deterrence on paper while multiplying risk in practice. Both commands believe they are acting responsibly. Both believe escalation can still be avoided. The problem is that once responses expand, intent becomes harder to read and miscalculation easier to trigger. Preparation begins quietly, long before any public signal appears. Inside Venezuelan command centers, the expanded response translates into a series of technical adjustments rather than dramatic orders. Radar operators are instructed to maintain longer active windows. Air defense crews rehearse handoff procedures between sites that normally operate independently. Patrol commanders receive updated rules of engagement, still defensive but broader in scope, with less time required to seek higher approval. For the personnel executing these orders, the change is subtle but decisive. Authority is closer to the front line. Confirmation cycles are shorter. The margin for hesitation narrows. From the U.S. side, intelligence indicators shift almost immediately. ISR platforms register altered radar behavior. Search patterns widen, emissions last longer, and coverage overlaps in ways that suggest coordination rather than routine training. Analysts flag the change as significant not because it signals attack, but because it changes the risk calculus. Patterns matter more than intent. Satellite imagery shows increased movement at coastal installations. Maritime patrol routes tighten. Electronic signatures fluctuate, hinting at intermittent jamming or testing rather than sustained electronic warfare. None of it violates established thresholds. Together, however, they form a picture of a force preparing for interaction, not isolation. Human factors begin to surface. A Venezuelan radar technician on his third consecutive night shift hesitates as a contact flickers at the edge of detection range. Under the new posture, he reports it immediately instead of waiting for confirmation. On the other side of the picture, a U.S. watch officer notices the same anomaly through a different sensor and marks it as a possible misclassification event. Both see the same uncertainty. Neither sees the full context. The intelligence cycle compresses. Decisions that once took minutes now take seconds. Automated alerts trigger human judgment earlier than intended. Communication remains intact, but interpretation diverges. This is the paradox of expanded response. It improves readiness while amplifying ambiguity. As more systems come online and more personnel operate under elevated authority, the environment grows dense with signals and assumptions. Every new data point demands interpretation. Every interpretation carries consequence. In such conditions, escalation rarely begins with aggression. It begins with reaction. The shift becomes visible just after midnight. Along Venezuela's northern approaches, patrol density increases not dramatically but deliberately. Maritime units adjust spacing. Air defense elements transition from passive monitoring to active coordination. Radar coverage begins to overlap in layers, reducing blind spots while increasing the volume of returns. What was once a controlled perimeter now feels compressed. From the Venezuelan command perspective, this is still restraint. No strike packages are launched. No missiles are armed for immediate release. The intent is presence forcing acknowledgement, imposing caution, reminding any observer that movement through this space is no longer uncontested. But expanded response changes behavior faster than policy can track. A coastal radar site detects a fast-moving contact skirting the edge of its coverage. Under previous rules, the track might have been filtered out, logged, and reviewed later. Tonight, it is escalated immediately. Contact is handed off to a secondary sensor. The system flags it as unidentified but consistent. That phrase, consistent, carries weight. On the U.S. side, the same movement is routine. A platform operating legally, predictably, and within established parameters. Its crew notices the change almost instantly. Warning receivers spike briefly. Tracking illumination brushes the aircraft for seconds before dropping away. Nothing overt, nothing hostile, but unmistakably deliberate. Commanders adjust posture. The aircraft alters course slightly, not to withdraw, but to signal awareness. Supporting assets reposition at distance. Communication channels remain silent by design. Silence at this stage is considered safer than clarification. Meanwhile, Venezuelan units continue executing the expanded directive. Patrol boats close gaps. Air defense crews rehearse target assignment in real time. Electronic systems pulse intermittently, testing reactions without committing to sustained jamming. Each action is measured. Each one, however, adds friction. The environment tightens. As overlapping systems feed data upward, the operational picture becomes crowded. Multiple tracks converge near the same grid lines. Civilian traffic, commercial signals, and military movements intersect. Automated filters struggle to keep pace. Human operators intervene more often. One contact stands out not because it is threatening, but because it behaves differently. It slows, then accelerates, then disappears behind clutter. The radar reacquires it seconds later. Another site confirms. The classification remains unresolved. Under expanded authority, frontline commanders are empowered to act defensively before uncertainty becomes vulnerability. A request for clarification moves up the chain. The response is delayed, not by indecision, but by volume. Too many signals, too many simultaneous decisions. In the gap between request and reply, a local commander makes a call. A targeting radar locks on briefly. A warning measure intended to assert control without crossing the line into engagement. The lock is released almost immediately, but the effect is irreversible. On U.S. displays, the lock is clear and unmistakable. Protocols shift. Defensive systems queue automatically. Higher command is alerted. What had been a managed interaction now carries the unmistakable signature of escalation. No one is fired, yet the situation has changed. Expanded response has done exactly what it was designed to do: raise costs, command attention, and compress timelines. But in doing so, it has also created a moment where reaction outruns intent. And this is where control begins to slip. The warning lock lasts less than 5 seconds. It is released exactly as planned, but 5 seconds is enough. Inside Venezuelan command channels, the action is logged as defensive signaling, measured, proportional, contained. The intent is clear to those who ordered it: assert control, force recalibration, avoid engagement. No missiles are armed. No follow-on action is authorized. The line in their view remains intact. On the US side, the interpretation is different. A radar lock is not context. It is capability. It is intent implied by proximity and timing. Automated systems do not debate motives. They respond to inputs. Defensive cues activate. Escort assets shift position. Command-level alerts escalate the incident's classification from monitor to active interaction. What had been ambiguity becomes risk. As systems adjust, a secondary complication emerges. Electronic interference, light, intermittent, and likely unintended, distorts identification data for a brief window. A track fragments reappears, then overlaps with civilian signal clutter. Operators attempt to resolve the picture, but the timeline has compressed beyond comfort. This is the point where doctrine meets reality. Venezuelan crews operating under expanded authority detect the US posture change and interpret it as confirmation that their signal has landed. US commanders seeing multiple indicators converge prepare for the possibility that signaling may not stop there. Neither side wants to be first. Neither side can afford to be last. A defensive maneuver is executed subtle, procedural, and irreversible. It is not an attack, but it is no longer neutral. The move crosses an invisible threshold where every subsequent action will be interpreted through the lens of escalation. The gap between deterrence and confrontation collapses not with an explosion, but with a decision made under incomplete information. This is the breaking point, not because weapons are fired, but because control has shifted from strategy to reaction. Expanded response is often misunderstood as a safer alternative to direct action. Technically, it avoids first strikes. Politically, it signals restraint. Operationally, however, it introduces a different kind of danger. The core issue is compression of decision time. When authority is pushed downward, frontline units gain flexibility, but they also inherit responsibility once held by higher command. Rules of engagement widen. Confirmation thresholds shrink. A radar operator, a patrol commander, or an air defense crew no longer waits for layered validation. They act to prevent surprise. In doing so, they reduce the system's tolerance for ambiguity. Technology accelerates this effect. Modern sensors do not merely detect. They classify, correlate, and recommend responses in seconds. Radar locks, electronic emissions, and maneuver cues trigger automated chains that assume worst-case intent. Human operators can override them, but only if they have time, clarity, and confidence. Expanded response removes at least two of those three. Electronic interference amplifies the problem. Even limited non-hostile jamming distorts track quality and forces systems into defensive bias. A fragmented signal is treated as risk, not noise. Civilian clutter weather effects and overlapping patrols further complicate identification. The battle space fills with almost hostile, almost confirmed, almost ignored. This is where escalation becomes structural. No single actor decides to escalate. Instead, escalation emerges from interacting safeguards. Each side adds layers to avoid vulnerability. Each layer increases system sensitivity. The result is an environment where benign actions generate hostile interpretations faster than they can be corrected. Cost asymmetry reinforces the dynamic. A brief radar lock costs nothing. Responding to it by repositioning assets, elevating alerts, or queuing defenses consumes attention, resources, and political bandwidth. Expanded response is designed to impose those costs. The unintended consequence is that it also multiplies pathways to miscalculation. In theory, restraint depends on control. In practice, control depends on time. Expanded response removes time, and without time, escalation no longer needs intent, only momentum. The immediate aftermath of the expanded response is not a battlefield victory, but a shift in posture. Airspace tightens, naval patrols shorten their reaction loops, command centers move from monitoring to anticipation. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is precisely the problem. Stability is replaced by constant alertness. Every movement is interpreted through the lens of what might happen next. Regionally, this alters behavior faster than policy ever could. Commercial traffic reroutes. Insurance premiums rise. Civilian aviation authorities quietly adjust flight paths. None of these decisions require official announcements, yet they signal that the risk threshold has already moved. The escalation is no longer hypothetical. It is priced in. Militarily, both sides absorb the same lesson. Ambiguity is dangerous, but hesitation is worse. Units begin to operate closer to the red lines, not farther from them. Patrols are reinforced. Sensor coverage overlaps. Redundancy increases not to prepare for war, but to avoid surprise. Ironically, these defensive measures compress maneuver space even further, making accidental encounters more likely. Politically expanded response hardens narratives without committing leaders publicly. Domestic audiences are told that deterrence is working. Diplomats emphasize restraint. But behind closed doors, crisis management channels grow more active, not less. Hotlines are tested. Back channels reopen. The system is quietly acknowledging that it is operating closer to failure modes than comfort zones. The most consequential effect is psychological. Commanders stop asking, "Is this escalation?" They start asking, "What if we don't respond?" That question marks a turning point. Once in place, it reshapes doctrine, training, and expectations. Escalation is no longer an outcome. It becomes a condition the system learns to live with. And systems that learn to live with escalation eventually normalize it. This episode will not be remembered for a decisive strike or a clear victory. It will be remembered for how close the system moved toward failure without crossing into open conflict. What unfolded was not a breakdown of deterrence, but its stress test. Precision operations met expanded response. Signaling met interpretation. Doctrine met human judgment under pressure. And at every step, escalation was shaped less by intent than by timing, perception, and compressed decision windows. No single order caused the escalation. No single commander lost control. Instead, control thinned incrementally. Each side acted rationally within its own framework. Each response made sense in isolation. Yet together they formed a chain where restraint required more effort than reaction. That is the defining danger of modern military confrontation. The margin for error shrinks faster than political leaders can react. This is not a story about aggression alone. It is a story about systems designed to prevent war that now operate permanently on its edge. About forces trained to signal strength without triggering conflict while knowing that signals can be misread. About a world where escalation does not begin with explosions but with assumptions. The lesson is uncomfortable but clear. Future conflicts may not start because someone wants war. They may start because no one wants to appear weak. As long as that dynamic holds stability, will depend less on superior firepower and more on restraint, communication, and the ability to pause when every system is telling you to act. Because the most dangerous moment is not when weapons are fired. It is when everyone believes they're still in control. Bye for now.